Thank you so much. That is actually one of my favorite parts, because I always like it when incarnations of New York City save children. It's just a quirk. Since we are here in Queens, and you read us a wonderful Queens section, and Queens, in fact, takes center stage for a good deal of the second book of the duology, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you created her character.
Oh, yeah, forget about this. Basically, I started from the premise of let's start with the stereotypes of New York, because people from outside of New York are going to be reading these books, or at least I hope they would, and they don't know anything about Queens. People who are not from New York barely understand what a borough is, and they constantly misspell it, but that's a whole other thing. But they don't really know what a borough is. They don't really understand the concept. Very few cities in the United States have boroughs. Even people, I discovered London has boroughs. People from London don't know what boroughs are. I don't really understand that. But okay, so I decided to deliberately start from stereotypes. What most people who have heard of Queens know about Queens is that it is the land of immigrants. So I knew that Queens was going to have to be, it's not entirely, obviously lots of native-born people are here as well, but it is one of the things that Queens is known for. So I wanted to have Queens definitely be an immigrant who is working towards, something here in the country. In my own day job life, before I became a full-time writer, I was a career counselor, academic advisor, a bunch of other things, internship coordinator. Anyway, but I tended to do that in STEM fields and at engineering universities. So I had a lot of international students who were dealing with a lot of the stuff that Queens ends up dealing with, especially in the second book. Excuse me. A lot of those examples of just bureaucratic horse stuff that she went through. I'm trying to work on certain language. Anyway. But a lot of the bureaucratic just nightmare that she goes through, especially in the second book, is stuff that my students went through. Employers exploiting them, ICE getting stuff wrong, bureaucratic, like a period wrong on a form and you get deported, like just ridiculousness. So I borrowed from actual experience in that case, just not mine. But because I was starting from stereotypes in the case of all of the boroughs, I wanted to complicate those stereotypes by making them much more three-dimensional. So everybody in the book starts from that stereotype place. Manhattan is this slick-talking guy who's got lots of money, but it turns out that he cuts people. He's kind of evil. And he's got family issues and a bunch of, he's a complex person. Ditto for all of the boroughs. I wanted to start from that stereotypical place and then make them real people beyond that. So that was basically it.
My favorite character is Branka. So I would love to hear a little bit more about her, but I don't want to bore people. So what I want to ask is, in the second book, you have, I think actually Branka says it, a sort of not throwaway, but a sort of aside about how more than one of the avatars of New York is an artist, because New York used to be a great place for the arts. And you talk about you allude to how that's changed over the past 40 years. And I was wondering if you could talk more about those changes, because they're so essential to what's happening in these books and because they strike at my heart.
And we're sitting in a museum. My own experience of New York is what informs this book. I grew up in artist New York because my father is an artist. I grew up in Black New York because I'm Black. My own sense of New York is what I was trying to share here. I was reacting in part to other people's conceptions of New York, Friends, Seinfeld. Like everybody has this idea of New York that has a certain look to it, which you don't see when you actually walk around regular New York. But what you see on TV is a whole other thing, and in the movies is a whole other thing. So I was partly reacting to that. I just simply wanted to share my own experience of New York. Art New York is overrepresented in this book. That said, I do believe that New York was, up until maybe the 80s or so, was the center of the arts in the United States. It was where the fashion industry came out of. It was the fine art industry. It still is kind of the peak of fine art, just not so much pop art and culture anymore. But pop art and culture came out of New York. Hip hop, all of that. LA, hush. Anyway, if anybody from LA is here, I don't want to hear it. Anyway, Queens and the Bronx. Anyway, but so I just wanted to share my own experience of New York. Part of what I am reacting against with this book is Lovecraft, because those of you that have not read Lovecraft or that are not familiar with H.P. Lovecraft's work, Lovecraft wrote a lot about squamous eldritch entities and creepy monsters and whatever. And then you begin to read his memoirs and his letters to his friends, and you realize he sees the people of New York as these monsters. And he is simply translating his disgust for his fellow human beings into this artistic metaphor. And it's not very much of a metaphor. When you read how he talks about people from Chinatown, it's not that different from how he talks about the old ones, the great old ones from beyond. He sees them as monsters. So my reaction to Lovecraft was, this man looks around the city, sees the diversity of the city. He was racist as hell. He was anti-Semitic, but married to a Jewish woman. Weird. He was afraid of milk. He had a problem with the Portuguese. Like, whatever. I don't know what the issue with the Portuguese was. He just really hated Portuguese people. Sorry, any Portuguese folks. I don't know what you call anti-Portuguesism. But anyway, he was, there you go. So he saw his fellow human beings as monsters. He saw the diversity of the city as something detrimental and dangerous to everyone. And I see New York City, I walk through Chinatown, and I see wonders. I see things I've never seen, since I've never smelled. I have an argument with a shopkeeper because I want some lychees, and he's like, it's $10 for you. And I'm like, it says $1. Anyway, like, all of that is like New York to me. And that is the richness and the power and the beauty of it. So I wanted to share that. But specific to the art thing, the other thing is that my father was the director of the Bronx River Art Center for until like the mid 80s or so. So I got to see a lot of the politics of art. I was a child, but I apparently absorbed more of it than I thought. And I saw, and I still see how when the city was cheap as hell back in those days, artists could thrive here. You could survive on $100 a month. You could rent an apartment for $100 a month. Back when I was a kid, like literally $100. Yes, I know, right? My father lives in a loft now that he got in the 80s. And back in the 80s, there was this thing that used to happen in a lot of parts of New York. The city was nearly bankrupt in those days. There were brickyards everywhere. Crack was an epidemic. But a lot of times in the more industrial parts of the city, because the city had lost so much business, the landlords would illegally rent out certain floors to artists as residential space. And these were barely livable spaces. They were not up to code. They were dangerous. They were full of chemicals. They had been industrial spaces up until a certain point. And the landlords were not cleaning these places up before they rented them out to the artists. And the artists would do things like form these collectives where, like, somebody who knew something about electricity would do the electrical work, possibly illegally, possibly not licensed. Anyway, somebody who knew something about plumbing would do the plumbing. They would just trade it for each other. They would trade it for paintings. There was a culture and a richness and a cheapness here that made it possible to be weird, to be counterculture, to be avant-garde, all of that. That's the New York I grew up in. So I just wanted to comment on, like, even like the little crack that I made about the subway craving a coating of graffiti. I miss the old painted trains. Like, yeah, it's nice that they're all super silver and all of that, but some of those old painted trains had just stunning artwork on them. If any of you had a chance to see 5 Points before some asshole covered it up, like, that was glory. And we've lost so much. So, I said I was watching my language. Okay, well, anyway, some bad person covered it up. Anyway, so, that was really it. And, you can't have a real art city where rents are $3,000 a month for a studio. That's not going to work. So that's basically it. I lament the loss of old New York. I'm okay with some aspects of new New York. I'm happy to not be stepping on crack vials anymore. But I do miss some of what we lost.
And one of the things you do in these books that I think is so brilliant is you take Lovecraft's evil, right, which he was essentially like, people of color in New York, oh no, very scary. And you turn it so it in fact represents the evil of gentrification. And I love that sort of turn back. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of how you represent that. That's not the right word, sorry. The technique you use to make that turn. Does that make more sense? No, I'm looking at your face, it makes no sense. I guess the links you make between gentrification and whiteness and evil, right? Which I think are absolutely, I didn't grow up in the art scene, but I grew up on the Lower East Side, so I saw all that happen as well.
If you grew up on the Lower East Side, you grew up in the art scene. That was where the guerrilla art movement was.
It was.
Sorry.
No, I'm sorry.
If people couldn't hear that, the Lower East Side was the heart of the guerrilla art movement. That was where a lot of like shady, illegal art galleries were, like art galleries where you could like fall through the floor, that kind of stuff. But they had good art on the walls if you didn't fall through the floor. Anyway.
And even if you did. And so I want to hear more about the thought process that led to twisting Lovecraft on his head like that. Because it's such a wonderful thing to do to turn him back on himself. Like, instead of ignoring him, you're undoing him.
So there were several things I was trying to do with that. I will try to go through all of them briefly. So one of it is that I think the quintessence of New York fighting back, the way that New York fights back, is that the people who are most affected tend to form the core of the resistance. So, when you've got any kind of homophobia, transphobia, queer people being bashed or whatever, don't do that shit down by Christopher Street. Don't do it in the West Village. You will get wrecked. So, like that to me is the quintessence of New York. Some racist people go into a black neighborhood, you will get wrecked. Just this is the New York flavor of it. Then that happens everywhere. But it is a thing that I see again and again happening in New York, and that has a particular power in my mind. Maybe it is exaggerated in that case by my experiences, but. The other thing I was trying to do, because Lovecraft saw horror in inclusivity, I wanted to point out the horror that already exists of whiteness. And when I am speaking of that, I'm not speaking of white people. I am speaking of the ethos that is whiteness. So to break that down, when white ethnic groups immigrate to the United States and have immigrated over history, have immigrated to the United States, they have, in almost every case, had to give up their own cultures. They've had to give up their languages, their foods. They have had to be absorbed into this kind of homogenizing whiteness that is necessary in order to maintain the racial hierarchy of this country, but it is harmful to white people as well because, you don't get to keep that aspect of your own culture. It is a devouring, homogenizing, amorphous, tentacular, squamous eldritch bullshit. So I just wanted to kind of flip that on its face. If Lovecraft saw monsters in diversity, I see monsters in homogeneity. And so that is really what I was trying to do. So I think that I'm getting at all of that.
Thank you. That was an excellent answer to a sort of disorganized question. Thank you so much. I want to open up to questions from the floor. I'll bring them.
Hello.
Hi.
I guess I have a question about writing, like your writing process, in terms of something that really impresses me with your work is like this big concepts, like complicated structure, lots of points of view, the narrative all weaves together, and then, but also the sentences are all great. And so,
Thank you.
I'm an MFA student in fiction, so this is a selfish question maybe, because I'd love to be better at that. So it's sort of how do you kind of, I guess, either do one or the other, or also how do you do both? Like, how do you keep the story doing what it needs to do structurally while keeping like the craft on a sentence level?
Building the story structurally, I do outline. I outline and I pants. I pants line. Anyway, so what I tend to do is I put together an outline that will be the structure of the story, and I start writing, and then I forget that I have an outline. I was recently diagnosed with ADHD. I now know that this is why I am like this. At the ripe old age of 51, I finally discover this. So I forget that I have an outline. I wander off into the fictional weeds and just do whatever feels right. And then I remember I have an outline and I come back to it. Sometimes I'm so far from the outline that I can't do that. I've got to break the outline and redo it all together because whatever I've written is better than what I originally envisioned. And I'm fine with that. It does mean I re-outline again and again. It also, for me, I try to just get the zero draft is what I call it. The zero draft is the one where I'm literally just sharding out words on paper. Sorry for that imagery. I'm still working on the vulgarity, guys. It's gonna be a while. But I just do it as fast as I can, getting the words down. In a lot of cases, the words are not clear or they're not pretty, or like I have the idea of what I'm trying to say down. I don't get the language right until revisions. And then I just revise and revise and revise. Revision for me is a joy. I love revision. Writing the zero draft is a chore and misery and will send me into depressive fits periodically, where my friends have to have interventions to stop me from quitting the book. But revision is where that horrible, sharded out mess gets refined and polished and turned into something nice. And it's, for me, then I see the book that I originally wanted to write. So for me, I can't wait for revision because then I can finally get to the book that I want to see. I don't know if that is what you're asking. But a lot of those really killer sentences that I was really proud of the buttered child canon sentence. But a lot of the sentences that make me go, "Ooh, yeah, that's good," I add in post. I add in editing because I need to get the core idea down first, and I don't have time for prettiness when I'm doing the raw writing. So revision is your friend. Mm-hmm.
We have a question from the Zoom
Okay.
asking why you chose to read this particular section.
Because I was coming to Queens. That was it. I wanted to read a Queens section. I did not think about what, in the wake of the tragedy that's happened in Baltimore, I did not think about that. And that is I apologize for that, folks. And I hope that I have not triggered anyone with that. But I wanted to read a section about Queens, and there are some really good ones in the second book, but I would have had to explain a lot more about what was going on in order for those to make sense. So this first section is fairly standalone, and that's what I wanted to go with.
Any other questions? Well, yes.
Oh, okay.
I kind of have a spoiler question a little bit, but I won't spoil it too much. But I will say, like, what was your inspiration, or I guess like your call to have Queen such a prominent like person in the second book? Like, why was she the person that, you know, kind of discovered everything?
In the first book, I centered, it's 5 boroughs, 6 avatars. I don't want to spoil things, but I did mention that there's an overall New York avatar as well as the 5 borough avatars. So I felt like I've never been good at writing large casts. So I felt like I was not going to do a good job of giving everybody the attention that they really deserved in the first book. So I wanted to concentrate on different characters for each book. When I originally thought this was going to be a trilogy, my thought had been that I would focus basically on 2 characters per book. 2 characters get a deep dive in each book. So in the first book, it ends up being Manhattan and Brooklyn, I guess. Although we kind of go deep on Bronca too. But yeah, so no, I'd say it's more Bronca than Brooklyn. So Manhattan and Brooklyn really kind of got the really deep treatment where we got to see more about their families, their background life, their friends, all of that. And in the second book, I was planning to do Queens, but I also was just going to make her a more general character. The pandemic happened. The first book of the series came out in March 2020. I got heavily depressed, along with a lot of folks. You know, lots of us were sitting at home and trying to figure out how we're supposed to figure out anything. And I was struggling basically to try and make this upbeat, funny, irreverent story work when I was feeling anything but that. I was sitting there, you know, kind of in this just gray funk, trying to write comedy. Like these books are meant to be my silly, lighthearted palate cleanser after the Broken Earth books. So, you know, I started trying to make them that. They were that, and then things happened that made me want to write about much heavier material. And I found myself struggling to write the second book. At that point, I reached out to my editor and basically said I didn't think I could do it as a trilogy anymore. I had enough energy left in me to make it work as a duology. So I rewrote the outline again, figured out what the biggest plot holes were that needed to be tied up. There are still some that are not tied up as of the end of the second book. I did deliberately leave a couple of threads for myself in case the urge came back to write a third book of this series. It could happen. It hasn't died in my head. But so far, nothing. So then at that point, because I had pushed off various characters until the second book, I needed to kind of wrap things up more thoroughly, and Queens was just sort of the perfect person to do that. The same kind of reasoning and understanding the mechanics that she demonstrates in that passage I just read turns out to be the key to a lot of the story. I don't want to go into it any more than that. So that was it.
Great, thank you. And more questions? I am watching the hands. I'm just watching them from back here, so feel free to raise your hand and I will come to you with the mic. Yes.
Hi.
Hi, I think the way you answered that question kind of leads to this very obvious question, which is, I imagine that a lot of us in this room absolutely love the Broken Earth series because it was so beautiful and powerful. And since you said you're not writing a third book, what are you working on now? And are you going back to writing something along the lines, like something that is more like fantasy oriented? So if you are willing or able to talk about what you're working on or what you're kind of inclined, even more generally, kind of looking ahead.
I am working on 3 things right now, one of which I will not talk about. One, I'm working on a short story for the first time in a couple of years. 2, I'm working on a screenplay in lieu of that short story. So I'm going to write the same story as a short story and a screenplay because I just learned how to write screenplays and I'm like super excited about it. And so I want to see what I like better as the means of getting the idea across. I'm not a super visual person, so screenplay writing has been weird for me. But now that I've kind of got like that switch has clicked, I'm starting to think in it better. And also I have discovered the wonders of Writers Guild health insurance, and I want to keep it. So I'm going to write a script and I'm going to try and get that script sold so that I can keep my health insurance. There's no premium. There's no premium, right? Anyway, okay, sorry. I was excited. Free prescriptions. Anyway. So that's the third thing that I am writing on is a possible novel idea. I cannot talk about my novel ideas while they are churning. They're too amorphous and squamous, but they also are fragile at this stage, and too much talk damages them. So I'm going to let that continue marinating. So.
We have another question from the Zoom asking if you could speak about how your education in college, beyond, before, has shaped you, influenced you as a writer.
Well, I've been writing since I was like 10 or like 8 or something like that. So it didn't. But, well, okay, no. My work in higher education was more of an influence. My education, I majored in college in psychology. I went to grad school for counseling psych. I did not ever take a writing class. I didn't even take English in college. I AP'd out of it. So, it didn't. Like, formal education-wise, I have no training in writing. I am self-taught. But in terms of my experience as a counselor, working with people, I mean, you just heard me say that Queens is an amalgam of several hundred students that I worked with over many years who had to deal with a whole lot of bullshit. Bad stuff I'm trying. I have a swear jar at home. It is already full. Anyway, you've already heard me say that Queens was drawn from my experiences. I also think that my education in counseling psych and my experience as a counselor helps me with characterization. Because I understand like the mechanisms of certain things. I understand that, some of it is just empathy. Anyone can develop empathy. It is a learnable skill. I do not believe you are born with empathy or not born with empathy. So it is a teachable skill. It is a thing that you can learn by learning to observe your fellow human beings, learning to talk to your fellow human beings, learning to just simply treat them as fellow human beings. Anthony Bourdain, I'm not going to quote it because I don't memorize that well, but Anthony Bourdain has this wonderful passage in his memoir where he talks about the fact that he traveled all over the world and he just sat down and ate with people. He sat down and ate with people in places where, conflict has been happening, where the United States has caused a lot of the conflict, yada, yada, yada. But he just simply sat down and ate with people. And he was talking about the fact that if you ask them, how did they make this? What do they think of it? If you express your appreciation and your joy, your appreciation of the effort that they put into it, even if you don't like the food, if you just sit down and just do this perfectly human thing of saying, your food is amazing, people turn into people with you. They are no longer... the person of a different race. They are no longer the person of a different culture. They're no longer the person from your enemy or, any of that other nationalistic, jingoistic nonsense. They're people. And it's a thing that I am starting to feel that we as a species are losing. We are losing the ability to just simply go and sit down with other people and have a simple goddamn conversation. Oh, fuck. Anyway. I'm going to put like $10 in the swear jar when I get home. But yeah, so we're losing something. So I just feel like my own experiences as a counselor helped me to I think, try and depict these characters as three-dimensional beyond the stereotypes that we went into.
So I'm wondering, setting-wise, this is a pretty substantial departure from the work that came before. At what point did you realize that you wanted to pivot to modern New York City, or modern anything for that matter, and why?
I wrote a short story called The City Born Great. I always have to remember the city we became, the city born great. Starting with the city is always a problem for me because memory issues go with ADHD. Anyway, so The City Born Great was a novella or a novelette that I wrote that got published in 2014, I want to say. And it was at the time a tester for a possible novel. A lot of my short stories I use as testers. I will just, it's not always the same characters that I'm going to use. It's not always, it's testing the setting to see if the setting is detailed and solid enough to support a whole novel. Or the premise in this case, because obviously the setting is New York. But the premise was New York comes to life and there's squamous eldritch monsters and people have the ability to use the archetypes of New York City as weapons. Or the memes, basically, as weapons. So I wrote that short story and then put it aside and worked on the Broken Earth books because I tend to do short stories in between novels. Short story brain and novel brain are different things for me. And so I finished the Broken Earth books, went, holy crap, that was a lot, and then decided I wanted to do something a little more lighthearted. Something not as heavy. And I'd always envisioned the end of, I'm not going to spoil it, the end of this trilogy. I always had this climactic thing in my mind. I just had never imagined how I wanted to get to it. So that was it, basically. But, you know, I wasn't sure that I wanted to write it as a novel at the time that I did the short story. But it worked, so yeah. Actually, I have a question for you guys. What do you think of Queen's characterization? Anybody who wants to go, be honest, seriously. I don't usually get the chance to get feedback.
After hearing about Queens, I was thinking about recommending it to a friend who's just changed to pure math as a major and loves math just so much.
Nice. Oh,
So I was like,
wonderful.
oh my God, she would love this.
Yeah. I mean, that was also drawn from an actual student of mine who was grinding through financial engineering and loved math, was more of an artist of math than anything else. Explained to me that math is an art. I had not understood this. But, you know, in the eyes of a person that can do math, I didn't make it past calculus. Well, I made it to DiffEQ and I didn't do well. But anyway, but that said, so, you know, I was drawing from a real experience in that case, but I'm glad to hear that your friend was able to get into that pure math that they loved because, you know, I hear that it's a wonderful thing to do if you have the math head for it. So,
Yeah.
good.
So it was fun seeing that little representation. I was like, oh my God, she would love this.
Oh, good. Anybody else? Nobody thought that I screwed up Queens? Seriously. I went to Hoboken and did a reading there not too long ago. And of course, once again, I read the segment where I was talking about the dude bros of Hoboken. And, you know, I asked the audience, well, what do you guys think? Am I about to get, you know, run out of Hoboken on a rail? And people were like, no, there really are a lot of bros here. So, okay. The thing I have not yet done is do a reading in Staten Island. For those of you that have read the book. I was supposed to do a tour, and then March 2020 happened, and I canceled the book tour. But I was going to start with a New York City tour and do a reading in every borough. Staten Island. I was going to start with Staten Island. Like, let's do this. You know, if I got to run, I've been working out. I can run. You know, so I still don't know what they think. We'll see how that goes someday. Yeah. Oh, thank you.
This is a community where there's so many people, like you go down the block and then you turn it and then you're like everywhere, you know, like you have everyone in a small radius. So I think that you did really well. I also think that you did really great with the relationship that everyone has, like all the New Yorkers have with Staten Island as well. I thought like that relationship was kind of good too.
Yeah, that wasn't hard. The hard part was I had to go to Staten Island and get to know Staten Island. I had the typical Brooklynites, Staten Island. I hadn't been there in years, and if I'm going to write a character, and if I'm going to make that character three-dimensional, and yeah, she's got some problems, but I wanted her to be a person. I wanted to portray her empathetically, not sympathetically, and so I hope that I managed that. Yes.
Well, first of all, I have some family on Staten Island, and I was laughing the entire time because it's
okay.
None of them are here, so I can say it. It's accurate. But in terms of the Queens side, because I'm from Queens, I think what I liked about it was, I think Queens gets overlooked a lot as a borough because it's not as cool as, or if people know Queens, they know like Astoria and Long Island City, which are great. I go there all the time, but like there's a whole other borough with a lot more to it. And so I just think the fact that Queens kind of gets overlooked or underestimated a lot, and then Queens as the like embodied character got to have some of those like heroic moments, I thought was awesome.
I tried to incorporate that in having Padmini be overlooked and underestimated a lot. You know, she's short, she's plump, she's cute as hell, but she doesn't believe it. You know, she's from a family that loves the hell out of her, but she doesn't really see or process that. She doesn't realize what a treasure that is. And, you know, I wanted her to be badass, but like super quietly so. Like you know, it's always the quiet ones who are serial killers, but also can be really great people and really amazing. And I wanted her to be kind of like quietly amazing. So I really wanted all of them to be that. Even Staten Island has her moments. So because these people are larger than life and they have, you know, extra dimensional powers, and you know, that's cool. So, well, thank you.
Do we have? Okay, then I'm going to take the privilege of holding the mic to say that one of the things you did that I really love, and I just want to make sure you get like public acclaim for it, is I think so often we think of New York City as a city of immigrants, but Branka is a true native New Yorker, right? She is a native person. She is Lenape, I think, and bringing to the fore that aspect of New York is, I think, such a wonderful thing to do. So it's one of the many reasons she's my favorite, but she is my favorite.
Branka is also the character I get the most criticism about, which is fascinating to me. It's a mix of like random people deciding that how dare this black woman write about indigenous people. Those folks aren't indigenous usually when they seem to have that objection. I don't really understand that, but okay. But, you know, I get like angry emails all the time, really long ones for some reason, from various people who are like, you know, I can't believe that you appropriated. And I'm like, I have met actual Lenape who live in the city. This is a thing that happens. This is not a thing that I just made up. Like, there are people like, anyway, sorry. Trying to keep the swear jar from overflowing today. But I also get a lot of criticism for the fact that Branka was depicted as old. And yeah, because there are a lot of people that think of the Bronx as a place of young people, which, you know, given the history with hip hop and yada, 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 I understand some of that, but I wanted it to be a mix of characters, not just all young people. So anyway, but I've met Brankas. I've met too many Brankas. They are wonderful people, not necessarily great friends, but I've met a lot of great Broncos, and I wanted to include that in the story. Bronco's the kind of person I'd like to grow up to be, not necessarily the kind of person that I want to be besties with. But anyway.
Well, I love her, and I love that she's old. She reminds me of my mother.
Okay.
Especially when they say, like, she came up in the 60s, she thinks everybody's FBI.
Yeah, well, she's not wrong. But anyway.
I want to thank you so much for coming here tonight and giving us such a wonderful talk and wonderful reading. There are books for sale from Q and Willow Bookstore, one of, I think, the 2 bookstores in Queens, just outside. 3? There are 3 now. There are 3 now. All right, wonderful. One of the 3 bookstores in Queens. You will be signing, I believe, at the table next to them. So thank you all so much for coming tonight.
Thank you.